The topic of today's talk by Mrs. Huti Watson is longing for justice.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko taku mihi tuatahi ki tō tātou matua nui te rangi nāna nei ngā mea katoa. O tira, kia kui mā, a koro mā, ko wehe atu. Nā rātou e whakapau kaha ki te whawhai mō tō tātou whenua, tai ao, te reo me era atu momo Māori katoa. Haere atu koutou ki te huihuinga o te kahurangi, oki ai. Rātou kia rātou, tātou kia tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia koutou ngā hunga ora, ngā iwi Bahá'í o te motu, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. I'd just like to reiterate one more time, of course, that these talks are only one perspective and do not represent the views of any institution or group. The title of today's talk is Longing for Justice, and will cover quite a lot of ground in terms of historical issues for Māori and pose some key questions that might help us to form ideas around approaches we might want to take within the present framework for action. Of course, these are only ideas being posed and in no way should interfere with current plans at the grassroots. We'll start with a quote from Bahá'í that is so pertinent to the following discussion. O Son of Spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbour. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behoveth thee to be. Verily justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes. We walk into the future looking backwards. This is a Māori philosophy, meaning we learn from the past in order to understand where we are going. Learning about history enables us to gain clarity on what the injustices are that various peoples have suffered in the past and continue to do so. And it's through that learning that we become more empathetic, more committed to building a just society, and be willing to make the sacrifices needed to ensure that everyone has a voice and everyone has a right to expect and receive justice. Community building efforts and clusters, projects and activities for social action and involvement in the discourses of society means working together to create and achieve locally owned goals. Integral to this approach is understanding the histories and context of tangata whenua, the people of the land, so that their aspirations for whānau, hapu and iwi can also become realised. And Bahá'í says, the light of men is justice. Quench it not with the contrary winds of oppression and tyranny. The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men. No radiance can compare with that of justice. The organisation of the world and the tranquility of mankind depend upon it. To be born Indigenous is to be born into a reality that is, in many ways, already primed for how our lives might unfold, and our levels of education, health outcomes, and other determinants are often predictable. Our colonial past and history of racial prejudice is so deeply entrenched in the institutions around which our society is ordered that inequities for Indigenous peoples are a reality from the time you are born until the time you die. For many, being engaged in acts of resistance is not a choice. It is a necessity for survival. And there are many examples of people I'm sure we can think of who have sacrificed their lives seeking justice, fairness and equity for their people. And this plays out every day in many ways in Aotearoa. The injustice marginalisation and social disadvantage experienced by Māori as a consequence of colonisation has resulted in numerous forms of resistance against forced cultural genocide, land confiscations, imprisonment, death, the removal of language, culture, and epistemologies. In its letter to the Bahá'ís of the United States, 22nd of July 2020, the House of Justice writes, "Racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life, while blighting the progress of the rest of mankind. It cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. The change required is not merely social and economic, but above all, moral and spiritual. Within the context of the framework governing your activities, it is necessary to carefully examine the forces unfolding around you to determine where your energies might reinforce the most promising initiatives, what you should avoid, and how you might lend a distinctive contribution." So many people lose precious years of their lives in resistance to injustice and in working to correct it. And this is quite a sad state of affairs. They are longing for justice and expend their lives in pursuit of it. The House of Justice consistently draws our attention to the possibilities latent within our communities to bring about social change through the systematic implementation of the instruments and methods of the current series of plans, which I'm sure you already know so much about with all of the beautiful talks Mrs. Alison Milston has given us. We all know they are three consecutive, interrelated and coherent spheres of action. 1, community building efforts in clusters. 2, projects and activities for social action. And 3, involvement in the discourses of society. And the House points to these approaches as being the means within which race unity can be promoted. As the House of Justice highlighted in its Rizwan 2015 message to the Bahá'ís of the world, ultimately it is systematic, determined and selfless action undertaken within the wide embrace of the plan's framework that is the most constructive response of every concerned believer to the multiplying ills of a disordered society. In such a context, the Friends can gradually assess the problems that face them and their surrounding communities. Systematic, determined, and selfless action within the parameters of the wide embrace of the framework of the plan. This provides the context within which the Baha'i community is operating and learning how to address the issues of society together. And I'd just like us to keep this vision in mind during the rest of this talk. So what are some of the approaches for addressing racial prejudice and racial unity within community building efforts and clusters? What kinds of meaningful conversations can we have that can result in projects and activities for social action on this subject in our neighbourhood? In what way can we appropriately engage in promoting racial unity and the discourses of society? And of course, you know, Aotearoa has one great example already, and that is the Office of Public Affairs Race Unity speech competitions. This has made great advances in the public discourse and indeed gained great mana among the many and varied organisations concerned with this kaupapa over the years. In the New Zealand context, the National Assembly speaks about the oppression suffered by Indigenous peoples and that the purpose of the coming of Baha'u'llah is to lift the yoke of oppression from his loved ones, to liberate all the peoples of the world, and to provide the means for their abiding happiness. Furthermore, they acknowledge that in Aotearoa there are inequities and injustices faced by Māori, and that we in this country are not exempt from the baneful effects of racial injustice. And so I thought I'd pose some questions, just food for thought. Do we have an understanding of each other's lives? Do we have an understanding of however small, what racial prejudice looks like, feels like, or sounds like from the perspective of the recipient? What protocols do our feasts follow? Whose cultural domain do they reflect? And what level of consideration is being given to create a loving and accepting atmosphere? What relationship should the Baha'i community have with the Māori community? Are we genuinely concerned or interested in what concerns them? How can the Institute process develop conditions in the community that enable everyone to grow in the same space? What can be done in the core activity spaces to promote racial unity? What does the individual, community, and institutions need to do to increase its understanding of the Māori community? Is it important to learn about New Zealand history in order to increase our understanding of Māori? And should we have spaces where systemic issues and the impacts of colonisation on Māori can be discussed? And I'd like to relate to you just a short story that pertains to this matter. Last year I was in New York and I was sent an invitation from New Zealand to attend a race unity gathering in Manhattan. Very strange state of affairs. So I finished the work I was doing and jumped into an Uber and went to the address I'd been given. As I approached the apartment, I noticed all these shoes outside and I thought, well, this must be it. And when the door opened, there was a room full of about 60 black people from diverse nations and backgrounds, and a few Baha'is, maybe about 5 only. There were a black couple, both Baha'is, facilitating a frank discussion with what looked like their entire neighbourhood almost, about racial unity. They just used a few questions drawn from quotes from the writings to frame the discussion. This was the first in a series of 10 gatherings to address this specific topic in that neighbourhood. Were there controversial comments made? Yes, absolutely. Were they hard to hear sometimes? Yes. But the facilitators were very knowledgeable and skillful in ways to address the issues that arose with great diplomacy and dignity, and they were always able to bring it back to some connection with the principles of the faith. It was really exciting to see this example in action in a place such as New York. Is this kind of activity something our communities would be interested in? If so, are there those equipped who could facilitate them? And if we wanted to be well equipped, what things would we need to know in order to do it? These are some questions to ask ourselves. Injustice has a whakapapa, or a genealogy if you like, which, if we're to create communities characterised by love, justice and unity, it would be helpful to try to gain an understanding of some of the fundamental issues of justice in relation to Māori. This doesn't require everyone to go out and learn the language or take a course and engage in all the aspects of culture, but it does require us to ask the question, what does justice demand of us? Are we open to new information? Are we ready to hear the tough stories? And friends, I'm going to relate to you now a tough story to listen to, and it really is about the history of our country and how we came to be here. The origins of international law were first discussed by Spanish man Francisco de Vitoria, a Spanish Roman Catholic philosopher, theologian, and jurist of Renaissance Spain, who expounded on theoretical issues surrounding the law of war and the rights of independent peoples, using the example of Christopher Columbus taking possession of the New World and the relationship between the Spanish and the Indians. Jurisprudence in medieval times in Europe was based on 3 types of law: divine law, human law, and natural law, with divine law assuming priority. Vitoria proposed a new system of international law which eventually replaced divine law and the Pope's authority at the time. It was replaced with natural law that is authorised by a secular sovereign, which became the basis for the new international law framework. Victoria concluded that ownership and property is the domain of natural or human law and not divine law, and that the lands of the Indians could not be removed simply because they were unbelievers in God, because they already had their own systems of society and natural reason, which he called jus gentium, which is a Latin word. Jus gentium gave the Spanish the right to travel in the land of the Indians, provided they did not harm them, and that the Indians may not prevent them. That sounds okay, so far so good. But Victoria then advocated that Spanish rule should be used over the Indians due to cultural differences, and proposed that the right to wage war and the acquisition of land were needed. These ideas were central to the events that unfolded in the Spanish colonization of the Indians, and it's important because it also shaped the doctrine of discovery that was later used to colonize and overtake native peoples of other countries of the world, such as New Zealand. While Victoria's ideas helped to shape the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine itself emerged out of a number of Catholic laws called papal bulls, issued by the Vatican in the 15th and 16th centuries. These laws allowed the monarchies of Britain and Europe the right to conquer and claim lands and to convert or kill the native inhabitants of those lands. Using this doctrine, European powers created international laws that allowed them to conquer states and create treaties with other sovereign nations, such as Te Tiriti or Waitangi in New Zealand. However, even though the treaty's existence emerged from this law, it was never actually incorporated into domestic legislation in Aotearoa, and therefore could not be binding on the government. So this is one of the many grievances that prolongs Māori's sense of injustice. If you want to put it into simple terms in today's context, you have one entity who enters into a contract with another entity, and the first one then does not live up to the terms of the contract. But there's no legal recourse for the partner to the contract to take, because there is nothing in the legislation to allow it. This doctrine is at the very core of the many injustices that Māori feel today. Historically, the doctrine of discovery was an international legal principle created by Europeans that allowed the British to automatically gain sovereignty and property rights in countries that they colonised without the consent or knowledge of the native peoples. But it only gave partial rights, so in Aotearoa an agreement had to be entered into between Māori and the British Crown, where Māori would give up or cede their sovereignty to them. And this is how the doctrine of discovery influenced the establishment of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. In 1839, a decision was made to bring New Zealand under British rule in this way. Shortly after this, William Hobson went to New Zealand as the Lieutenant Governor to begin the process that resulted in the signing of Te Tiriti. The use of the doctrine of discovery also meant that the Māori chiefs could only ever enter into a treaty with the British Crown, and was a document meant to express a partnership between the two sovereign nations. One element of the doctrine of discovery was contiguity, which meant that Europeans could claim land that surrounded their settlements, and much Māori land was lost in this way. Māori were unaware of all of these issues when the Te Tiriti was put before them for discussion on February 6, 1840. In New Zealand, the doctrine of discovery continues to abolish Māori rights, and it is still being used to undermine treaty settlement processes. Because when representatives of the Crown are requested to apply Te Tiriti or Waitangi in their negotiations, they state that only the doctrine of discovery can apply, and they will not discuss the treaty document itself. The background to the signing of Te Tiriti is that in the early 1830s, Māori chiefs of Ngāpuhi were becoming increasingly concerned about the lawlessness of the English settlers who were coming into Aotearoa in increasing numbers, and they looked to the British Crown, who they felt should control their own people. These concerns were discussed at several meetings of the chief at what was known as whakaminenga o ngā hapu, and demonstrate that there was intent by the chiefs to explore how the British Crown could assert control over their own subjects. In 1835, the chief signed He Whakapūtanga o Rangatiratanga o New Tirene, the Declaration of Independence, a document that declared that sovereign power and authority over the lands and people lay with the United Tribes of New Zealand. A total of 52 chiefs signed the declaration, which was formally acknowledged by the British Crown in 1836. The document clearly identifies the language that the chiefs use to declare their sovereignty. Ko te kingitanga, ko te mana I te whenua o te whakaminenga o New Tirene, ka mea tēnei kei ngā tino rangatira anake I tō mātou huihuinga. The kingship and sovereignty of the land of the Confederation of New Zealand shall reside exclusively with the chiefs of our assembly. This is strong evidence that the Māori chiefs were very clear as to the meaning of the word sovereignty by their use of the word mana, and that it was used to demonstrate their absolute authority over the land. Therefore, it's safe to conclude that the idea of sovereignty in the minds of the chiefs was interchangeable for the word mana. He Whakapūtanga laid the foundation for the treaty, and this point is important in relation to what the chiefs understood when they later engaged in discussions and agreement about Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The British Crown was experienced in entering into treaties with other nations by the time they presented the Treaty of Waitangi to the chiefs of New Zealand. The chiefs were a people who had an elevated understanding of their authority or mana over their lands due to the tribal system that they lived under. The treaty has two texts, and the English text, known as the Treaty of Waitangi, was translated into the Māori version known as Te Tiriti o Waitangi by Reverend Henry Williams and James Busby, the British resident. The British intention in presenting Te Tiriti o Waitangi to the Māori chiefs was to gain a formal declaration and treaty between the two sovereign nations that recognised Māori cessation of sovereignty over their lands and people to the British Queen. The Māori version of Te Tiriti o Waitangi was supported and signed in 1840 by over 500 Māori chiefs representing various tribes of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and by William Hobson, who represented the British Crown. This agreement cemented a formal relationship between the Crown and the Māori tribes. According to the first article of the English version, Māori gave up or ceded sovereignty to the British Queen. In the Māori version, Williams should have used the word mana to describe sovereignty, as was done in the Declaration of Independence 5 years before. But instead he inserted the word kāwanatanga, a transliteration borrowed from the English meaning governor, governorship, or government. By using kāwanatanga instead of the correct translation, which was mana, the chiefs did not fully understand its meaning. Māori would have had little experience with the word kāwanatanga and little understanding of it. But if the word mana was used, it is believed that the chiefs would never have agreed to give this up. The discrepancy between the use of these two words shows that the Māori chiefs, and Ngāpuhi chiefs in particular, did not knowingly cede their sovereignty to the British Crown, and in this fact was later upheld by the Waitangi Tribunal findings in 2014. As there had been ongoing concerns about the lawlessness of the British settlers and the need for the British Crown to intervene, it would be safe, therefore, to presume that the chiefs of the time would have been readily convinced that the reference to kāwanatanga was about British governance of their own subjects and not Māori. When Williams translated the English version of Te Tiriti into Māori, Williams and Busby were both well aware that the proper translation for the word sovereignty was mana. Busby in particular was involved in the forming of He Whakapūtanga, the declaration, so he would have known about this fact. The giving up of mana was inconceivable. It was an inconceivable notion in Māori societal norms and impossible according to Māori law. The differences of understanding between the two versions and these two words have been a source of debate and disputes between Māori and the Crown for 180 years. In international law, where there are two versions of a treaty, and one is written in the language of the native peoples, there's a principle known as contra preferentum. It's also known as the right of colour. This rule is applied to treaties where there are disputes between the two versions, and they provide against the party who drafted it, in this case the British Crown. It rules in favour of the Indigenous language version, which means that the Māori version of the treaty should have been ruled in favour of, and using this measure shows that the English language document would not hold equal status with the Māori version. However, when the New Zealand government passed the Treaty of Waitangi Act in 1975, it denied the use of the contra preferentum ruling in this country and empowered the Waitangi Tribunal to consider both versions equally. By doing this, the Crown removed the rights of Māori to enact this rule. Counter to this are the views that favour the English version of the treaty, where the New Zealand government affirmed that the Māori chiefs ceded all the rights and powers of sovereignty over their territories, and they then formed the basis for British rule over the Māori people. So that's the state of affairs today. But even if we do accept the English version, the issues continue. So in the English version, the second article of the treaty guarantees to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand and to the families and individuals full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands, estates, forests, fisheries and other properties that they wish to keep.
I found this on the web.
But it allowed for the sale of land only to the Queen. Only a few years later, in 1862, the British Crown made war on Māori and forcibly removed much of their land, and in so doing breached the treaty. Māori grievances about their land rights have been the subject of treaty claims to the Waitangi Tribunal, who makes recommendations to the government on claims by Māori that have breached Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Many Pākehā New Zealanders believe that Māori should not have these rights, and they don't understand that Māori are a rightful partner to the treaty and the Crown, and this is a reason as to why there's widespread lack of acceptance of the treaty. In the third article, the Queen extends her protection to the natives of New Zealand and gave them the same rights as British subjects. However, the British Crown then made war on their subjects to forcibly remove their land just a few years after the signing of the treaty. Māori often question whether they have been given the same rights as British subjects, as there are stark inequities, institutional racism, poorer health, education and other outcomes, worse than other ethnicities, as well as legislation that continues to discriminate against them. The New Zealand government was formed in the years following the signing of the treaty and established parliamentary sovereignty in the belief that it had been given the right by the chiefs to do so. As a result, the New Zealand government had the authority to rule and make up its own laws, and they did not allow for the treaty to have legal standing in New Zealand law until 1975 with the Treaty of Waitangi Act. This meant that for 135 years, Māori had no means to properly enforce their rights or have the ability to act as a legal partner to the treaty. This was in conflict with the purpose of the treaty, which was the ability to share power between the two partners, and remains the barrier to a true treaty partnership between the Crown and Māori to this day. And it's at this juncture that I'd like to discuss this notion of partnership. In terms of the long-standing treaty disputes that Māori have, it is with its partner, the Crown, and no one else. It isn't with individuals, the family down the road, or organisations who don't represent the Crown. These individuals and organisations can develop relationships with Māori and recognition of the intent of Te Tiriti as tangata tiriti, or people of the treaty, or an ongoing program of education and expressions of goodwill and allyship. And it's a positive thing for all peoples of Aotearoa to understand the issues in order to increase understanding and empathy. But the work to be done to rectify the grievances belongs to the two partners, Māori and the Crown. Again, in simple terms, if this were your contract, you wouldn't be expecting someone else to fulfill it in terms of it, would you? One more point in closing this section. There are many Māori Bahá'ís who aren't magically exempt from treaty issues. Many of us are landowners, and as treaty partners have the right to engage with the Crown at differing levels, at different times, and we do. And this, no doubt, will be ongoing for many years to come. To emphasise this last section, I want everyone who's watching today to visualise what it might have been like in pre-colonial times. And I want you to think about Māori society at that time and what aspects of society were still intact. Now, because this is a virtual meeting and you're not with me and you can't give me the feedback directly, I'm going to mention some things that people in previous sessions like this have shared before. So in traditional times, land was still in Māori hands, people lived in their tribal areas, religious beliefs were in place, the language was in place, traditional education systems were still being enacted, the traditional ways of life were being practiced, tikanga and cultural practices were still in place. Our tohunga, our priests who looked after our health and other aspects of our well-being, were still there. Health practices such as rongoa, Māori herbal medicine, and other ways of health were still in practice. Tapu and Nor ceremonies were still being used. Our sacred sites were protected. And there might be many other aspects of Māori life that were intact in those times that you can think of. And so we move to the next era when contact with European missionaries and settlers took place. So what happened? So during the period of contact, missionaries, whalers and traders came first, then settlers. There was conversion to Christianity. Diseases broke out that Māori had no immunity against, and there were heavy death tolls. Trade was a mainstay of the relationship. There was an introduction to alcohol and tobacco, and there was intermarriage. Te Tiriti was signed, followed not long thereafter by land wars, and large tracts of land was taken. Assimilation policies to westernise Māori were instituted, and sometimes there were massacres, legislation introduced that stripped away rights, schools were replaced, the wharewananga, language was banned in schools, health declined, the tohunga, the high priests were outlawed, and ceremonies and practices declined. And during this period, the population of Māori reached its lowest point. Now we move on to the present. And this current context, Māori are represented disproportionately in statistics. Recognition of the intergenerational effects of colonisation and the consequences of it is fairly well known now. Great efforts are being undertaken by Māori to draw on cultural frameworks that strengthen the spirit and the well-being of the people. There's been a renaissance of the language, a renaissance of the culture and many facets of it. Treaty settlements are assisting in economic development, although many of these settlements are seen as not full, not fair and not final. There are ongoing grievances and demands for justice. I realise, friends, that much of this information is readily available to you elsewhere. However, to be able to take time to look at this together and to discuss and think about it in our communities, if there has ever been a better time, it's now. To hopefully be more aware to be open. When we love someone, don't we get to know as much about them as we can? That's what we do, so that we go into the relationship with our eyes wide open. In the 9th of May letter, 2020, the House of Justice writes, Baha'is recognise that they must strive to remain conscious of the effects of the prevailing destructive forces in their society, lest to one degree or another they unwittingly become influenced by them. However, they must also be careful not to be swept up in a spiral of fear and darkness engendered by these forces, but rather devote their energies to building up a new world. As they do so in the context of the plan's framework, they will no doubt develop the capacity to protect themselves against these same forces. In this light, you are encouraged to identify other like-minded individuals, both from within the Baha'i community as well as from the wider society, with whom you can collaborate in learning how to address pressing social issues at the grassroots through any of the 3 areas of action referred to above. For instance, participation in the discourses of society. Of course, in doing so, it is important to steer away from becoming entangled in the political dimensions of any particular issue, and instead strive to uplift people's vision by calling attention to the root causes of the challenges at hand and the principles of the faith that address them. To the extent that your efforts in this regard are pursued in a learning mode, you will, over time, be able to refine your approach and become more effective in your endeavours. Keeping in mind this quote, I'm suggesting, friends, that there's a fine balance in being keenly aware and knowing the issues and being fully informed, but then not getting caught up in them. We should be up to date with treaty issues and how it affects tangata whenua, and we should be aware of the suffering of the people, of the racial disunity that is rampant in our community. But ultimately, we have to keep in mind the 3 areas of action. We know the healing remedy to the world's ills and need to be engaged in collaboration with others to learn how to refine our approach and become more and more effective in addressing the issue of racial disunity and bring about the justice that people long for. The House of Justice further on this point says, conflict and contention are not permitted. The Universal House of Justice had written, there are many well-meaning people who are striving to improve society by fighting its evils, which usually means contending against individuals, groups, or institutions who are seen as oppressive, unjust, or corrupt. Yet no matter how high-minded a particular cause might be, if it is advanced through contention and confrontation, it merely provokes and intensifies the flame of a counter-movement initiated by others who act on what they consider to be their own high-minded beliefs. Real solutions remain elusive. The cycle of contention continues without end, with one group after the other seizing enough power to implement its views before becoming overcome by those in opposition. One need only look to the endless mutations of racist oppression over hundreds of years, adapting so as to undermine every social advance in that area. And the Kitabi Baha'u'llah states, conflict and contention are categorically forbidden in his book. Therefore, Baha'is must not allow themselves to be drawn into the struggles and conflicting interests that divide many factions and groups of humanity. While we should not be idle in addressing social ills as the process of disintegration accelerates, our aim is not to choose sides in contentious social debates simply to proclaim what we believe to be right. Rather, the object of our participation is to learn to elevate discourse and improve practice as we work with others in the search for effective solutions. It is through understanding, sharing, and transforming into practical action the distinctly spiritual and social teachings of the faith that we can offer our greatest contribution to the betterment of society. So we've just covered quite a bit of detail about the historical influences that have impacted on whānau Māori, and hopefully we can start to understand a little why the call for justice has been so bitter, so drawn out, and so painful for many, and something about what our response might look like. Abdul Bahá'í said, "The most great work to accomplish is this, that you must strive so that the believers of God in America may arise to union and concord. The most important feat in this day is harmony and agreement. No soul must interfere with another, and no one must find fault with the rest. Praise be to God that all of them are believers in the beauty of Abha, and Abdul Bahá'í is glad and happy on that account. But they must arise to perform good deeds according to divine instructions, so that they may guide the people with heavenly actions and manners, to such an extent that all the inhabitants of the world may draw conclusions from their behaviour and deeds, that these persons are Baha'is. For the manifestation of such deeds and actions from anybody else, except Baha'is, is impossible and impracticable. This is the foundation of the religion of God and the law of God. Blessed is the one who practices them." Aloha pa, dear friends. I hope you found this talk useful today. Ngā mihi kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. Haere e hika, koutou ko mātua, unuhia I te rito te hara keke, ka tū I te aroa kapa. Aku nui aku rahi e, aku whakatamarahi ki te rangi e, waiho te iwi e, mana e mai noa. Kia mate ia nei koe hika, ko ata mira te waka ko hutu tai hirangi e, ko tai o pua pua ko te raro tua maheni e, ko arai te uru ko nuku tai me meha, ko te waka ihi ai e, te whenua nui nei.